in 597 BCE, and subsequent campaigns that followed, the inhabitants of Malchei Yehuda, the kingdom of Judah, were deported towards Babylonia. We know that's where they would be held captive until the redemption. And as they, our people, our ancestors, stood at the banks of the rivers of Babylon, with the waves of the Euphrates and the Tigris before them, Jeremiah the prophet, Yirmiyahu Hanavi, composed and recited Psalm Kuf Lamed Zayin, Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs. Our tormentors for amusement, they said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. We responded, how can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? How can one sing after watching the destruction of the temple, the razing of the city of Jerusalem? But Jeremiah did in fact answer the call for song, a song which has become the backbone of our Jewish existence now for over 2,600 years. It was a song that he taught then, which would become the anthem of exile. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yamini. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Im lo ale es Yerushalayim arosh simchasi. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. And we sang that song then, and we continue to carry that song with us in our commitment to never, ever forget Jerusalem. And along with it, the vision of returning, we will never abandon. We direct our prayers to her, begging God for the redemption thrice daily to restore us to the land so that we can once again walk Ba'ari Yehuda v'chutzos Yerushalayim in the cities of Judah and the environs of Jerusalem. It was, after all, towards that place where the call of Lech Lecha was once first heard. And we today continue to hear that calling, Lech Lecha, to go out towards it. But this evening, we're not going to focus on the historical and even perhaps spiritual perspective of Jerusalem. Rather, what we will strive to do to commemorate during this period of 3 weeks in which we have the marking of the destruction, to focus on the personal, perhaps even emotive connection that we have to Jerusalem. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the tale of the two brothers which shared a piece of land, 2 hills, and the valley between it. They were farmers. The valley was fertile and they had much crop. And after each harvest, they would divide the bounty in half and bring back to their respective homes the bags of grain. The elder of the brothers, he was a man with a family, the younger a bachelor. The elder with the family, having returned with his plentiful crops of grain, thought to himself, the younger, he may grow old without family to look after him. He must deserve more than my fair share. And in the dead of night, he went down from his hill towards his brother to give him extra grain. The younger brother had a similar idea. He said, I'm a bachelor, my needs are but few. My older brother with a growing family, he needs more. And he too, in the dead of night, took the surplus grain to give to his brother because he felt his brother deserved more than his own fair share. They, of course, met at the middle of the valley, realized what each was trying to do, embraced one another, in love and brotherhood. As the story goes, that would be the place which Jerusalem would be built. Well, friends, I can tell you right now that there is no scriptural text that supports such a story ever happening. No rabbinic teaching which ever links specifically to that tale. However, that story, if you would have heard it, was simply because it was told from person to person, from generation to generation, perhaps over hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. And that's the importance of a story. A story enables us to hit to the very heart of the matter. And if we are successful this evening in sharing perhaps some of our Jerusalem stories, what Jerusalem means to us, then maybe all of you will be inspired to share your own and perhaps to create some, so that our singular narratives can become a collective one, and please God, turn into the greatest story with the ultimate ingathering of the exiles and the building of the Bet HaMikdash speedily in our times. We're now going to begin with Rabbi Daniel Fine from Stanmore, who will share his Jerusalem tale.
Okay, Shkoyach, thank you, Rabbi Feldman. Thank you, the communities. I have to say, it's just lovely to see the three neighbors coming together, almost, Rabbi Feldman, like your tale. Proximity of land and sharing, etc. It's just lovely to see a joint communal effort. And so our job is very simple. We have a few minutes, each of us, to effectively convey our experiences of having lived in Jerusalem. I have to say myself, I was there for my formative years, meaning from age 18 till age 30. I'd like to share with you a couple of experiences. Again, these are personal experiences. They're experiences that happened to me, but probably shaped, I would say, elements of my vision, certainly shaped what Yerushalayim, what Jerusalem was for me. So a little bit of background. When we got married, we lived in a quaint little Jerusalem neighborhood by the name of Har Nof. There are about 30,000 Jews there living in Har Nof. You won't see a car on Shabbos. You'll see one van on Shabbos in Har Nof. That is the van that takes the doctors and nurses to working in the hospital and from the hospital. In Shabbos, basically, you can hear a pin drop at certain times. You go outside during Sukkot, and it feels like in the evenings you're in a football stadium. In the days where people could go into football stadiums, there is noise everywhere, echoes everywhere, because everyone has their sukkah on the balcony. In fact, they build the flats in these kind of neighborhoods such that people can have sukkahs on their balconies, because of course we know you can't have one sukkah underneath someone else's balcony. So they build them such that they're protruding around the building. It's that kind of area. It's beautiful. So I'd like to give you a couple of insights into what I experienced living in Har Nof, being married in Jerusalem, and the reflections of really what Jerusalem meant to us as a family. The first story is probably a little bit scary initially, but I think it brings out a point of, I would say, emunah, and also simplicity that is Jerusalem. I think many of us who have merited being in Jerusalem, whether on holiday or for an extended period, you'll notice there's a certain spiritual sensitivity, a certain spiritual susceptibility, if you like. That is, of course, the Kotel, and it expands, it resonates, emanates outwards from there. There's also a certain element of simplicity. Jerusalem is not materially rich per se. It doesn't have the comforts of life that other cities or countries have, but it has a certain element of simplicity that sometimes goes hand in hand with emunah, with faith, with trust in Hashem. So here's my first story, and it goes as follows. It was Sukkot. It was actually Friday night of Sukkot. We were very excited. It was first night Sukkot, and we invited an English friend who is in yeshiva for the year. A guy actually I'm close with to this very day from Chigwell. He's actually getting married in a couple of months. And he was excited to spend his first Sukkot in Jerusalem. We sat down, we had a lovely sukkah balcony, which kind of seated 4 people. depending on how thin one was. And we were about to begin our meal. Great. We looked at the Jerusalem skyline, in the background, and everything was beautiful, serene, quiet. The entire neighborhood were about to start their Friday night meal, their Yom Tov meal, their Sukkot meal. And then there was this absolutely massive clang or crash, or I don't know what it was. I've never heard anything like it in my life. It was like this massive bang and then things splintering. At that point, the entire building, and I'll tell you about my building in due course, everyone runs out of their sukkahs into the stairwell. You'll see this is not the first time this kind of thing happens, including the Dayan who lived on top of me, another Dayan who lived on top of him, the French family, the American family, the born in Israel and I don't think have never left Jerusalem family, the family that moved in from Mexico, the family that lived in Bnei Brak and came to Jerusalem, old, young, etc. That was the cacophony that was our building, the variety that was our building. Anyway, everyone moves into the stairwell. What happened? There were building works at the time going on floor number 5. Now, I lived on floor number 2. And number 5, I think they were away for Sukkot, they were building works. I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with Jerusalem stone. I'm not going into the history, but Jerusalem stone is large, it's thick, and very heavy. What had happened was the following. Due to the building works on floor number 5, a massive slab of Jerusalem stone, if I can, it's hard to do with my hands because I have to keep them in the screen. It will say, 3 screens worth, if that's a measurement, worth of massive Jerusalem stone slab had dislodged from number 5 and floor number 5. It had come sailing down. Actually, probably sailing is a bit too placid a word. It had come crashing down right into the sukkah of floor number 3, in other words, the sukkah above us. Who was sitting in sukkah number 3? Now, this is not a big sukkah. There was Dayan Havlin, who was our neighbor upstairs, his entire family, and a child. It was not a big sukkah. That stone or that brick went straight through their sukkah roof, landed in the middle of their table, sliced through their table, stone splintered. Everyone was absolutely fine. There was 1 or 2 small scratches, but apart from that, everyone was fine. Right? Happened to be that, by the way, the next day, the council came, of course, shut all the sukkahs off. So that was our sukkah experience gone. That was Bradley, bless him, from Chigwell, will never forget the experience. But that was our slight Jerusalem miracle in I don't know what the statistics are in terms of a stone coming down, 8 people around the table, and it landing in the middle, decimating everything. In classic Jerusalem humor, of course, Dayan Havlin's wife turned around and said, "Oh my goodness, that's it. The first course is ruined." So only Jerusalems can laugh at, real Yerushalmim can laugh at, things like that. But that was one, that was emunah, that was faith. The other thing that I noticed, certainly in Har Nof, and I'm sure throughout Jerusalem neighborhoods, is the amount of kindness, the amount of chesed that goes on. Now, a lot of it is hidden, by the way, completely hidden. Example, I was working for a yeshiva at the time, and don't ask, but last minute, the yeshiva decided that we needed a Shabbaton. The problem was we hadn't really planned the venue. So I said, you know what? I live in a nice, hospitable neighborhood. Let's, I'll do a Shabbaton. This was like on the Tuesday. Meanwhile, I had to find places for these boys to stay, about 30 of them, on Tuesday for the Shabbat. Right? Within about 2 hours, the message went out. Various friends, I know him, I know him, I know him, no problem. Hosting and the Shabbaton was wonderful. We'll talk about what happened before that again in a minute or so. At one point, I chanced across a book library. Why did I chance upon it? Because it was hidden. Why was I so impressed by it? Because there were 30,000 volumes of books in this library. It was started because of something, I think someone had passed away kind of before their time, one would say. And they lend these books out routinely to yeshivas, to places of learning. Something, I never knew about it. No advertising, no showing off, no fees, no nothing, nothing like that at all. At one point, there was actually not someone from the neighborhood, but a kid who had gone on a hike, a teenager who'd gone on a hike on a Friday and had got lost in the Jerusalem forest. For those who know your geography, Har Nof is like on the cusp or on the border of Jerusalem. And it's the last thing before you leave or enter Jerusalem, depending on which way you're coming from and to. And the Jerusalem forest kind of borders Har Nof. Anyway, so he got lost in the forest, and on Shabbat they sent around this car, announcing, can everyone kind of please help and look for this kid in the forest? Again, this teenager, sorry. Everyone at that point left their Shabbos meals, strode into the forest. Saving lives absolutely is something which is crucial, and if that meant forsaking Shabbos, then that's what it means. That was the chesed of Har Nof. Two other couple of brief memories before we hand over the microphone. Again, just to appreciate what living in Jerusalem means. And I know for Rabbi Feldman and Rabbi Levine and Rabbi Koetz will agree with me. I think sometimes you only appreciate locations once you've left. You know what I mean? Sometimes, not a case of the grass is always greener, but often you're comparing. When you're in Israel and you're English, you like to think, oh, I'm English, I'm not Israeli. I don't give advice to people on buses about their, 6-month-old kid. I'm English, I'm reserved. You know what I mean? Whereas sometimes when you're in England, you think, everything I learned in Jerusalem, all the things I picked up, all the spiritual resonance when you walk the streets, it's something special. It really is. So here are the other two anecdotes that I remember. Again, tinges of sadness, but shows you what Jerusalem life was and what Jerusalem life, I guess, is. And of course, part of this is we pray for total peace, both in Jerusalem, but in Israel at large. I remember one morning I got up to daven as normal. And as I got up, I heard this banging in my head. I thought there was, I didn't know what was happening, the banging. And then I heard something which I thought were fireworks, which I thought was a little bit odd for like 7 o'clock in the morning. Now, for those who know the Har Nof history, there was an awful terrorist attack in one of the shuls in Har Nof. Without going into the details, but I know actually our neighbor was there. There were two terrorists who entered this shul and who killed 4 people, actually 5 people eventually, and it changed to a certain extent. It changed the neighborhood for months afterwards. There was also a Druze policeman that was killed in defending that attack, and to this very day, and I've taken groups here, there are bullet holes in the glass as you go into the shul. Very vivid. They've kept them there as almost a memorial. Apart from the plaque, they've kept them there. Now, after that, I remember this was our route every day, and I used to daven in that shul every evening. After that, in the aftermath of that attack, the unity, but national unity, the amount of politicians that came to that shul to see it, the amount of just beautiful thing. They made an entire ceremony in memory of the Druze policeman there. One of the local rabbis got an entire delegation of Druze people. You're not normally going to see kind of like, Israeli Haredim and Druze in a common ceremony, right? And talking about their loved ones and talking about the lives they've lost. That was arranged. The element of unity, there were letters sent between various Jewish communities where, unfortunately, terrorist attacks had happened, letters of consolation sent between. There was from Itamar to Har Nof. Har Nof then sent a letter to Pittsburgh, was quite well documented. The amount of unity that was fostered after tragedy, I think, was something notable. And again, something very Jerusalem-y. The last thing I personally remember is the bomb shelters. Now, what were the bomb shelters? So, in England, we laugh that you've got 11 Jews and 2 shuls, right? I think that's what we normally say. Or the Jew on a desert island who constructs himself 2 shuls. One shul he davens in, the other one he wouldn't be caught in, for anything. Har Nof was densely populated, and you had shuls interspersed, kind of every 5 or 6 buildings on average. You needed a shul, because by my calculations, there were more people in my building in Har Nof, our apartment building, than lived on my entire street that I grew up in Hendon. Therefore, you need a decent amount of shuls. Anyway, our shul was in our building. It doubled up as the bomb shelter. So it was probably physically and spiritually the safest place. Anyway, I remember at one point we had occasion, unfortunately, to run to that bomb shelter. And for Rabbi Levine, Rabbi Feldman, I think you may have been there at the same time, when the rockets were, I think it was Operation Cast Lead, when the rockets were being sent over from Gaza. I remember my family and I were running towards these bomb shelters. And again, the camaraderie and the everyone helping each other. We had young kids. and making sure that everyone reached the bomb shelter safely, making sure everyone was okay. And then all the food, it's Israel, of course, so you have the food given out in the bomb shelter, and then the food after the bomb shelter, and the various different cakes and things, left on people's doorsteps because people felt they needed it. Just a real remarkable thing, a remarkable place. And we're gonna, at the end, we're gonna have a few minutes about Achdus, the unity of Jerusalem. But to see people who, to be honest, had we walked past in the street in various different places, I don't know, my French isn't great, to talk to the French family on floor number 7, and the Israeli family on floor number 1, we had nothing in common, but we were all in Jerusalem. We happened to be all in the same building, and therefore we davened together, and therefore we socialized with each other, therefore we talked to each other, and it was a lovely feeling of camaraderie in a very simple life, but a life which was spiritually satiating and very spiritually satisfying. So that was my Jerusalem experience, and we are going to hand over to
me.
Absolutely, you.
Good evening, everyone. Lovely. And I should leave this in for a second. Lovely to. This is not the football. This is so I can hear this meeting. Lovely to be here, and thank you so much to Rabbis Fine and Feldman for so far sharing with us your thoughts, your insights. And Rabbi Fine, I truthfully, if you were talking about those meaningful memories in Har Nof, I thought you were going to talk about the Purim Sudas, the Purim meals that we had together, and then as you were talking, realized why you couldn't possibly talk about them, because we don't remember them. They were that good. That was we were reminiscing actually about that on the phone today, and that was our own sort of little bubble of northwest London in Har Nof, and we had some very meaningful times there together. Friends, it's lovely to be with you all. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to take a little different track, and I want to talk a little bit more about the old city and the Kotel on a very personal level, and my experience. And I'm going to be very honest, sort of living in Israel, living in Jerusalem, and having visited so many occasions before I actually went to live there. I went to live there at the beginning of 2005, and I spent the best part of 7 years living in Israel. It's where Lisa and I met. It's where we got married. I'm going to come back to that in my third little anecdote. But before that, I'd spend many summers in yeshiva trying to chap as much as I could in between university terms, many family holidays, and I was in love with the country. I didn't want to be anywhere else. Still, if you go around our Shabbat table, as we so often do, and talk about where do you want to go to in the world, I usually just come back to Israel because I'd still rather be there. But I had a very interesting relationship myself with the old city and the Kotel. And of course, it's like one of the first places you want to get to when you go back to Jerusalem. And I loved being there. But so many people around me, I just always remember feeling like there's something wrong with me because I don't have this incredible spiritual high when I go to the Kotel. I have a very short attention span. And usually when I end up at the Kotel, I'm sort of too busy looking at the birds and the people and the trees. And, and I remember I'm actually trying to daven. And it's a wall and it's noisy and people push. And every time you're trying to get into a prayer, someone else is asking you for tzedakah. And the lady that was trying to force these red bands on your arm as you're walking through the streets. And I don't know, I loved going. It was one of the places I'd want to go. But I found myself a little bit, uninspired at times. And I felt there was something lacking in me. And I felt very guilty about that. And 3 things changed that about me. And I still a little bit, get very distracted when I'm there. But I still would rather pay there than anywhere else pretty much in the world. But 3 little things. And the first one is, which order should I do it in? I'll do it in the following order. Okay, so the first one was in yeshiva. I was learning. I was very trying to use what short attention span I had to the best of my ability to concentrate and to focus. And there's a thing on a Thursday night where we used to stay up even later than normal and dedicate extra time to learning. It's Thursday night. It's the end of the sort of formal week in learning in yeshiva. Fridays is a bit more like a weekend in Israel for many people. And although we did learn in the mornings, we'd stay up quite late on a Thursday night. Didn't do it every week, but some nights we used to stay out quite late, even to the very early hours. And then a small group of guys used to jump into a cab very early in the morning and take a cab over to the old city and daven nates, daven the sunrise minyan at the Kotel. And one week you know, sunrise is wonderful, but I'd rather have a good night's sleep and have a better davening, not having stayed up all night. But still, why not? Living in Jerusalem, I was single, I had no real responsibilities. Let's try it. So I went along, we had a good night learning, we jumped into a cab, I was exhausted. It was pitch black. We get into the old city, and I experienced one of my most memorable moments in Israel, in Jerusalem, and at the Kotel, where you join it like any other. If you've ever been there on a Friday night or any weekday, whenever you go for especially around service times, like early in the morning, Shacharit or Mincha or Mariv, whatever it might be, pockets of services all starting at their own times, their own paces, or different colors and this and that. Languages almost, it depends on what you're listening to, and again, for me, very distracting, especially on little sleep. But we get in there, we find our corner, we start davening, and it's getting a little bit lighter. And Nate's, right, that is the time where the sun starts to rise properly. That is the optimum time, we're told, that we daven the morning services. So it's quite a special thing to stay up all night learning, and then to daven Nate. And we're there with hundreds and hundreds of people. And what's incredible, so let's say Nate's was at 5:53 in the morning. Let's just use an example. And all these services that are working and running independently and so different from each other, and all the people that are so different from each other, but at 5:53 and a few seconds, all of a sudden, the Kotel goes silent. And I got a lump in my throat. And there was something so powerful to me, because every time I'd been at the Kotel before, it was noisy and busy, and everyone was doing their own thing. And it now felt like we were all together doing something, praying together. And it was so busy, but it was so quiet and so peaceful. And for about 5 minutes, however long it was like that. And I truly felt, I said, this is what it could be like to stand in temple times with hundreds, thousands of people flocking together, everyone coming from their own world, but coming to this point, to this place, to this holy, special place where our hearts, minds, and souls can be joined together. From that moment, it changed my feeling a little bit and helped me to sort of embrace davening at the Kotel and my relationship with the old city in a much more positive way. Second, less of a story, just one of the experiences, and you know, Rabbi Fein and all the rabbis here, as we mentioned it, Jerusalem, a bit like Israel in general, when you're living or when you're spending time there, it's all about these experiences. Have an opportunity, go at every kid that's going on their year off. My one main piece of advice is, if there's an experience, go for it. Don't pass it up. Even if it sounds crazy, the hike's crazy, the tour's crazy, the opportunities, just do it, experience. There's so many wonderful, we've got thousands of stories we could share. But one of the experiences that I found most meaningful, jumping forward now a couple of years, when we got married, and when Racheli was born, so we used to occasionally on a Shabbat, we lived in Ramat Eshkol, which is like the opposite end of Jerusalem to Har Nof. And I would say our walk to the old city would have been about an hour. I can't remember exactly what it was. Maybe it was a little bit less. And occasionally on a Shabbat afternoon, we would just, especially in the summer when Shabbat was a bit longer, we'd just get up and we just say, fancy a walk? Yeah, let's fancy a walk. And we would just put Rachel in the buggy and we would just walk to the old city. We'd walk just to finish Shabbat at the Kotel, to finish Shabbat, and you see all people from all walks of life, everyone that you walk, because you're walking to, it's a bit like walking to Shul on Kol Nidre, and everyone's just walking to the same place. You know, it's like that so many times in Jerusalem, but especially for that Shabbat afternoon period, so many people are flocking to the old city and to Jerusalem. Again, you feel like you're a part of something that's so much greater than yourself. And those Shabbat afternoons that we used to do that really had a big impact on my life. But really, I want to share the following story. Now, some of you from Belmont might have heard, if you've had Shabbat with us, and we've got onto the topic of how Lisa and I met, but there really is an amazing story about the Kotel specifically that more often Lisa, my wife, likes to talk about. But it's a little bit how we met. And there is a segula, like an omen of going to the Kotel for 40 days in a row, 40 days at the Kotel, to pray for something. if there's something in your life you need or is lacking, whether that be health-wise or sustenance, parnasa, marriage, children, whatever it might be, specifically to take a 40-day period and to use that and daily go to the kotel. And it's said to help with the davening, to help with tefillah, to help with the omens, to help with the mazal, the fortune of a person. And Lisa openly talks about, through her early mid-20s, how she'd been dating quite a lot living in Israel. She actually went to live in Israel at almost exactly the same time that I did. Both early 2005, she went her way, I went my way. We didn't know each other, we hadn't met. I'm not going to tell the whole story of how we met because that is a much longer story and I've only got a minute or two left. But just this part of the story is based around the fact that it was approaching the month that leads to our high holy days. And one of our English friends, who I happen to be very friendly with as well, suggested to Lisa, who was feeling particularly low at that point, about the dating process, about meeting loads of guys, but none of them seemed to fit, none of them were right. One said, why don't you try 40 days at the kotel? Go 40 days at the kotel. And this lady said to her, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I think it's something you need to do. And she said that she felt a force inside of her that was pushing her to tell Lisa. So Lisa thought about it. She went home. It happened to be at the time Lisa was working in the old city, and she was traveling to the old city every single day anyway, Bar Shabbat. And she decided that she would talk about it with one of her close friends that she worked with. They had a conversation about it, and it just so happened to be that this friend, who also worked in the old city, her and her husband had been married for several years, and they were desperately trying to have children. They hadn't been zeicher, they weren't merited to have children, and it was very hard for them. And in the conversation that Lisa was having with this girl, with this lady, about going to the kotel for herself for the 40 days from the beginning of Elul all the way through to Yom Kippur, this lady said, you know what, I'm going to do it. And it turned out that her and her husband, along with Lisa, my wife-to-be, picked the same 40 days. They didn't do everything together, but the same 40 days. Lisa was davening that she should be able to find her shidduch, her zivuk, her soulmate. And this couple were praying that they would be able to merit to have children. To cut a long story short, the only time that's difficult to get to the old city when you're not working there is Shabbat. And she lived in Har Nof at the time. And she convinced a couple of her friends to take it in turns, that they would do the walks with her on a Friday night back to Har Nof. And on one of the walks back, a friend who I happen to know back from university days suggested me to Lisa during these 40 days. And one thing leads to another. And 2 months later, because time works in mysterious ways, we ended up meeting. I hadn't been on any dates with any girls in that period of my life. I'd been sort of learning and I'd been shunning off any suggestions that had come, and something pushed me to say yes to this one. I'd never heard of Lisa. We ended up getting engaged not long after that, and we got married. So there's two things I want to share about this story. Number one, the end part, which I'll come back to in a second. But number two, when Lisa speaks about these experiences, she speaks about what it was to go to the old city. She went every single day, even though she worked there, but she removed herself from that work environment and she went down to the old city, to the kotel, to the wall. And she said the same kapitel, same psalm every single day. And she noticed herself going through a process. And of course, going to the kotel for many people, as I said before, and for myself as well, don't worry, it is a spiritual experience. It's something that helps us to focus, helps us to push to try and open our hearts even more than we can do in certain other places. And she said through that experience, she transformed herself. It forced her to focus what it is to get married. Is this something that you really want to do? Is one person prepared to really give up so much in order to marry someone else, to become a partner with someone else, and so forth and so on and so forth? I haven't got time to go through the whole thing now. But the process of doing that not only transformed her spiritually, but it also transformed her emotionally, because she was able to connect with the issues that she was thinking about when it was that she wanted to get married, the reasons behind it, and really pushed her to focus and understand who she was on that journey. Very powerful for her, and something that was the kotel was at the very front, the very focus on. But I'll end with this. She did it in the month of Elul, and we met that was sort of in, let's say, August time, September time. We met in November. We were engaged at the end of January, beginning of February, and we got married in June. And Lisa and her friend, as they were going down to the old city, as they were going down to the kotel on one of their walks in the middle of this 40 days, Lisa turns to her friend and said, the biggest bracha that we could have is that you couldn't come to my wedding because you had just had a baby. Now, that's not what happened. But we got married in June. This lady was 8 months pregnant. And 1 month after our wedding, she and her husband had twins. They just made their bar mitzvah of their eldest son. And something about that experience for them, something so special and powerful about this place that we focus all our tefillahs, all our prayers to. And that's something I always think about when especially when you go to the Kotel for the first time on a new experience, a new trip. You're standing there at the Western Wall, and every person around the world, their hearts, their prayers are focused to where you are standing. Something so powerful, something so precious. And I know the sentiments that I'm saying is something that I'm sure can touch all of your hearts. And hopefully, like me, you're chalishing it as well. And we're very excited to go back there. So I just wanted to share my experiences. Thank you for allowing me. There are thousands of stories, little tiny anecdotes I could share with you, but my time is up. So I'm going to pass now over to Rabbi Nicholas Koetz to share his thoughts, sentiments, and experiences of Jerusalem. I hope if he's not there, I could talk more. There you are.
Thank you, Rabbi Levine, and good evening. Oh, can you hear me now? Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Rabbi Levine, and good evening. As you can see, I didn't get the memo about no jackets, but I'm stuck with it now, so just got to ride on through. It's a really big pleasure to be able to share with you my thoughts this evening, especially given the fact that I grew up in Belmont. So a lot of the people watching tonight will remember me at the time of my history that I'm talking about. So that's a really special opportunity. I'm not actually going to talk about the experiences that I had living with Shira in Jerusalem for the first 2.5 years of our marriage. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. And we have very many fond memories, and we got married there as well. But actually, I am going to go a little bit further back tonight. And I'm going to start with the following question. What do Bono, Natalie Portman, and Hummer SUVs have in common? And the answer is that they all helped shape and form my attitude and my feelings towards Jerusalem to this day. Very tenuously, I might add, but here we go. So the story really for me starts when I went on tour in 2001. I was blessed to have been on many holidays growing up and visiting Jerusalem on a number of occasions in Israel. And when it came to tour in 2001, I got up the day that we were visiting the old city and was excited, as many people were, but there was one difference to my experience to the experiences of others. See, I'd seen it all before, and our tour guide took us through the old city, and I'm busy pointing out, oh yeah, there's that, and that place is good shawarma, and that place has good bagels. And for me, it was a great experience, a great atmosphere. But something happened when we got down to the Western Wall that really gave me a bit of a reality check. Because as we were coming down, descending the steps down to the Western Wall, and everyone is gearing up for it, the tour guide is preparing us. I've seen it all before. We get down to the plaza and we do our things and we take our pictures and we put our notes in the wall and everything like that. And I see at the back of the plaza, there is a group of my friends who are crowding around this one boy. His name was Bono. It wasn't the singer from U2. I did say it was tenuous. So Bono was from Leeds, and he was sitting there bawling his eyes out at the back of the Kotel Plaza. Why was he bawling his eyes out at the back of the Kotel Plaza? Because he was 16 years old. He had never been to Israel, and he had never been to the Western Wall. And for him, the emotion was so overwhelming. The experience was so overwhelming. He had been brought to tears by the experience, by seeing the remains of our temple, by seeing the remains of a wall where thousands and thousands of Jews flock to each and every day, each and every year. And he was just completely overwhelmed by it, and it brought him to tears. And I remember thinking to myself back then, what does he have that I don't? I'd seen it all before. I'd become very desensitized. I'd become very dulled to the experience, and that really, really stuck with me. And then in 2003, when I made that bold Belmont move to go to yeshiva for the year, so that was always in the back of my mind. For those of you who don't know, I studied in a yeshiva that is right across the plaza from the Western Wall. It's called Nativ Aryeh, and just for a bit of perspective, allow me to share with you now where it was, just so that you guys can get the perspective. For those of you who don't know, that is the Western Wall. And if we scoot around just a little bit over here and zoom in, that was my yeshiva. That was the balcony that we used to pray on, that we used to schmooze on, and that is how close we were to the old city. But for me, there was another aspect to this that was even more challenging, because if we scoot a little bit over here, just past Hakotel, ignore that, Rabbi Fine. So just over here, that was my bedroom, overlooking the Western Wall as well. So taking the experience of 2001 with me to when I went to yeshiva in 2003, it became a very interesting challenge to try and make the experience of living in Jerusalem, but more particularly living in the old city, and even more particularly than that, living across from the site of the temple, facing the Western Wall. That for me became a very, very big challenge, because as we know, it is so easy to become desensitized to things the more that we're exposed to them. But I was very, very insistent that I wanted to try and make sure that that the experience that I had out there was not one where I just became completely too comfortable, too overly comfortable. Let's just leave it at that. Now, by the way, where does Hummer fit into this? Again, very tenuously, but Ira Rennert, who was the owner of Hummer, he was the primary donor for Yeshivat Nativ Aryeh. So I owe a lot to him. I owe a lot to Bono, and I'll mention in a minute why I owe a lot to Natalie Portman as well. So it's 2003. It's September. We're coming up for getting close to Rosh Hashanah. It's my first night in the old city. Now, coming from Belmont, coming from JFS, I didn't have much of a yeshiva background. Amongst my family and my family circle of friends, it was really probably Gideon Morrison Wood who kind of dipped his toes in the water and kind of cooled the water down for the rest of us when it came to being able to make the decision to go to yeshiva. It wasn't what a lot of people did from JFS and what a lot of people did from Belmont as well. So it was all new experiences and we didn't know what to expect. And we arrived late at night. We got to my dorms. I've already shown you where the building was. Now, when I applied to yeshiva, they asked on the survey, who would I want as my roommates? What type of room do I want to have? And they gave us a bit of a scale. So they asked us the question, how frum do you want your roommates to be? So I said, preferably not on the frum scale, right? Not too frum, not too fanatical. My grandma from Blackwell, Grandma Miriam, she cautioned me before I went to yeshiva. She said, if you come back with those curly whirlies behind your ears, I'm going to kill you. That was always playing in the back of my mind as well. So I come to yeshiva that night. I'd requested a room where the roommates would not be too frum. And I'd also requested a room which would not really be the party room. I don't, as much as I like to be able to socialize, I didn't want my room to be that place. So we arrived, it was late at night, come into the room, and there's a guy asleep on the bed, one of the beds, and all he had was a white shirt, a pair of blue trousers, and his sandals on the floor. He didn't have any belongings whatsoever. He didn't have any bags, he didn't have any suitcase, nothing. All he had was just those clothes, that was it. Not only that, but he had payas all the way down to around there. And I thought, oh, is this what my year is going to be like? Anyway, he woke up, and it turned out that he was just saving the bed for his friend who was coming in from America, and he was in a completely different room. And the only reason why he had long pairs all the way down to there is because he had arrived from California with extremely long hair, and he'd been asked to cut it back a little bit. And so as an act of defiance, he'd left himself with these enormous pairs. And 17 years later, he still has them and is a very successful rabbi out in America. But there we go. So my first night in the yeshiva, in that dormitory, was a very nerve-wracking one. I was a bit on edge. And I remember being woken up at about 4 in the morning to the sound of, and that was the sound of the mosque over on the Temple Mount, calling everybody in the area to prayer. And I'm thinking to myself, first night, first experience in the yeshiva environment, and I'm going to be woken up every single night now at 4 a.m. Thankfully, I learned to sleep through that. But it was this experience, it was all of this hitting me very, very hard and very, very sharp, how I was going to navigate my time out there to be able to appreciate the place where I was. Now, I mentioned Natalie Portman. I'll share that story with you as well briefly. One night, my friend and I were walking from the yeshiva. It was dinner time, and we were on our break, and there was this whole commotion down at the Western Wall. We didn't know what was going on. And it turned out that Natalie Portman was down at the Koetz filming a scene for one of her upcoming films. It wasn't Star Wars, but she was filming a scene for an upcoming film in which she apparently was kissing the Israeli actor, and everyone was going crazy. And everyone was like rioting and protesting and everything like that. And people were saying, oh no, they weren't actually kissing, they were just acting, whatever it was. But all of these experiences and all of the ones that there's just no time to share with you this evening, it made me realize that we have a very, very special place right outside of the window. And it was a big challenge every single day to remember where I was, to align myself with where I was, to be able to appreciate where I was, but more importantly, to appreciate what is there and what is not there. That was also part of the challenge of living in the old city and having it there every single day. Is on the one hand, you come to love having it right there, but on the other hand, it becomes a challenge to appreciate what used to be there. When I became the assistant rabbi in Bushi a couple of years ago, and I was asked to do a shiva house for somebody in Hampstead. So I arrived at this apartment building, and I was about to conduct the shiva, and all of a sudden this gentleman came over to me, and he just wanted to ask me a question. And he said, why is it that we say the phrase that we say to mourners, Hamakom Yenachem Etchem B'toch Sha'ar Ve'lei Tzion V'Yerushalayim, may the Almighty comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. He said, why are we mourning Zion and Jerusalem? Well, Jerusalem's an amazing place. There's so many hotels, there's so many restaurants, it's a beautiful city. Why are we mourning it? And I was struck. I didn't have an answer for him straight away. So naturally, all I could think about when I was praying was how I was going to answer this guy. And the following thought came to me during that Shiva service. The thought is that, yeah, on the one hand, we have an amazing city. It looks beautiful. The restaurants are amazing. The atmosphere is electric. We are so blessed. One of the other stories. It's not only my favorite experience, but it's probably one of my mum's favorite experiences as well, was Yom Yerushalayim. When I was living in the old city, every single year you get thousands of people marching, descending down to the old city. They dance through the streets of the old city. The atmosphere is incredible, right? You have thousands and thousands of people celebrating Yom Yerushalayim. And I remember trying to call my parents just to let them hear. We didn't have cameras back then, right? Trying to let them hear the singing and the atmosphere. And it went through to the answer phone. And my mum kept that message on her answer phone for years because she always loved hearing what it all meant, what it's all about, what it means to so many people. She had it on her answer phone for years until I deleted it by accident. But anyway, so I said, We're so lucky to have what we have. We have a beautiful city. It's incredible. And we can't underappreciate that. We have to appreciate what we have. But we don't have everything. We don't have the Beit HaMikdash. And the mourning of that, the Avelut for all of us, is the challenge, the lifelong challenge of realizing what we are missing, realizing that piece that is still incomplete, right? So even as life goes on, and we've now not had a temple for thousands of years, and we're able to move on, and not only that, but we're able to appreciate what we have. So when it comes to a family in mourning as well, life will go on, but there's always going to be that missing piece, right? So it becomes a challenge for each and every one of us to really do our own exploration and our own cheshbon hanefesh, our own introspection as to what Jerusalem really means to us. That's a big, big challenge. If we think about it, we pray every single day for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, for the coming of the Mashiach, for the re-establishment of the Davidic reign. But how much do we actually think about it? How much do we actually mean it? Do we understand what we're missing? Do we understand, for example, that, you know, when Mashiach comes, there's not going to be coronavirus, there's not going to be illness in the world. There's a piece of us that's missing, and it becomes a big lifelong challenge for us to appreciate it. So that is my journey, as it were, my experiences in Jerusalem. My time spent in yeshiva was absolutely incredible, absolutely life-changing. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for my time in yeshiva. But on the other hand, for all of us, it's important for us to think about when we're becoming desensitized to something and how we can rein it in and how we can pay attention to what we have. So that's all from me. And I am now going to pass over to Rabbi Feldman, I think.
Rabbi Feldman.
Yeah.
It's quite incredible because my colleagues and I, we didn't discuss ahead of time what each of us were going to share. So it's really special that Rabbi Fein focused on living as a married man in Yerushalayim. Rabbi Levine focused more on his later years before he got married, and Rabbi Koetz focused on his yeshiva experience. I'm going to wind the clock back a little bit beyond that even. My story is very intimately connected, in fact, to the 3 weeks itself. You see, my bar mitzvah took place just on the cusp of the 3 weeks. And instead of having a large party, a dinner to celebrate, I received instead a very special gift. My parents said to me that as a gift for my bar mitzvah, we would go to Israel. It would be the first time I was getting on a plane, much less going on a journey to another country, and certainly the first time I would be in Israel. Now, I probably didn't appreciate it fully at the time, but my parents had a very specific idea of what it meant to go to Israel as a gift. And they wanted it to be clear that when one goes to Israel, it's not like going to Miami, Marbella, Monaco, where you focus on the beaches and the nightlife. Going to Israel should always be as it was once, which is being Ola L'Regel, a pilgrimage. It should be an experience. And therefore, they probably don't even remember this, but they're on the Zoom this evening. They gave me a book to read before I went, to take with me. I'll bring it up onto the screen if I can. This was written by Rav Hanoch Teller, and it's called "And from Jerusalem His Word." It was right after the great Rabbi Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the great leaders of Jerusalem, had passed away. And Hanoch Teller wrote a book about this great man, Rabbi Auerbach. That would be the only book that I would take with me when I'm going to Jerusalem, going to Israel. And rather than staying in a hotel in the Plaza, the Ramada, or something like that, we instead rented a flat in a quite Israeli suburb within Jerusalem called Beit Vegan. And staying there, I was really placed into Israeli culture. The makolet, the shops, the discussions, the various religious communities. It wasn't a holiday. It made me feel what it meant to be part of Israel and to be part of Jerusalem. And there are many stories that took place during that particular visit, which are very memorable to me, but I want to focus on just one of them. As I said, this was 3 weeks. We flew, it was already the fast of Tammuz had taken place, and now it was time for Tisha B'Av. Now, remember, I'm 13 years old. This is going to be my first real fast, the 9th of Av, and it's in Israel, and it's going to be hot. You would think that parents would be sympathetic to the concerns of their young boy and allow him to have a lie-in in the morning, put him in an air-conditioned space to be cooled off, not that the flat had any air conditioning anyway. Instead, I was woken up at 4 in the morning, shaken, 4 in the morning. And I said, what's going on? They said, it's time to get up. I said, time to get up, why? I said, we're going to the Kotel. We're going to the Kotel at 4 in the morning on Tisha B'Av. So I said, we need to go to the Kotel. So I get into the car. It's 4, by that time, you could still park really close to the Kotel in those days. We get there about 4:45 in the morning. It literally felt like I had entered into a totally different universe. The place was heaving. And all I saw around me were people sitting on the floor, bawling their eyes out. They had been up all night, crying about the loss of the Beit HaMikdash, and now preparing to daven at sunrise, and then to go into the kinnot that we recite, to go through the whole book. I was 13, and I sat there, and I prayed, and I went through the whole book. The sun already quite beating on my head before we left. And as I stood there around noontime, time to go back home, I thought to myself, perhaps this is what it feels like to be a Yerushalmi, a Jerusalemite, of what it means to care about Jerusalem so much that it completely takes over what you would consider to be sensible and thought out ways of managing time. In Jerusalem, you just feel more. I would go on to have many Jerusalem stories. I traveled back to Israel twice in high school. I then had the wonderful opportunity to go back to study in yeshiva. I would end up being there for 11 years. I was a student there. I was a young married man there. And I became a father of a young blossoming family. Many stories. But I'm going to fast forward to my final story. And if the first one began 25 years ago, this last one only took place 18 months ago. 18 months ago, Jacqueline and I celebrated our oldest son's bar mitzvah. And we were thinking to ourselves, how are we going to celebrate it? What type of gift can we give our son? And I remembered the gift that my parents gave me when I was becoming bar mitzvah. And I said, I want to give that same gift to Reuven. Let's go back to Israel. He is properly a Yerushalmi. He was born in Israel, born in Jerusalem. And we did that. We arrived towards the end of December, and I took Reuven through all the junctures and stops along the way that I had gone on my own journey. We went to see where I first had my experiences. We went to the yeshivas I had studied in, and we studied there as well. We received the blessings from the rabbis who had once blessed me. And then we celebrated the bar mitzvah in the same place where I received my smicha, concluding in the house where Reuven's pidyon haben had been 13 years prior. I wanted just to share the fast forward picture from 18 months ago. Reuven's taller now. I'm not. You know, I had a thought that it might be nice for me to give Reuven a copy of, and from Jerusalem, His Word, the same biography book that my parents had given me. But I think I thought better of it. You see, that was my story. And all I could do for Reuven was to give him the tools to be able to start having his own. And that to me is the significance of the story. That each of us have our personal experiences, but when we hand it over to someone else, we then give them the foundations and the abilities to hopefully make their own chapter. I think that's what's been going on through the generations of our people. Every single time we recite L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, please God, next year in Jerusalem, that's another chapter which is being created. And as I said in the beginning, these are each our own personal, emotive Jerusalem stories. But hopefully it shares a picture of what Yerushalayim means to our soul, to our mind, to our national narrative, and hopefully to our future as well. I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Fine to close the evening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Feldman. I have to say, one of the most pleasurable parts of the evening was watching the reaction of Rabbi Feldman's parents as he told the story of being woken up at 4 a.m. Just beautiful to see the generations. We're going to close with a few words about the Achdus, the unity of Jerusalem. I hope you've got a certain semblance and a resonance of what it meant to live in Jerusalem. And the truth is, I hope that, please God, when we have the occasion and opportunity to go back to Jerusalem, it's not going to be the same place. I don't mean that geographically or spiritually it's not the same place. But I mean, for us who are going to visit, it's not the same place. It's not a case of just going to a hotel. It's not a case of going to restaurants. It's a case of connecting with the basic purity and spirituality that is the place that is Yerushalayim. Why does Yerushalayim breed Achdus? Why is there unity in Jerusalem? So Jerusalem is the city of Shalom, the city of peace. The way Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch puts it is Jerusalem is like a mother that comforts their child. Mothers are great at saying, you know what, you've done this, but I think you can go further. Mothers are fantastic at recognizing who you are and your potential where you can get to. Mothers are great at being sensitive enough to add those perfect words when you think or they think you can progress that little bit more. Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, is that comforting mother that says, you know what, we've done this, but I think we can get more. Yerushalayim looks for its children. Yerushalayim wants its children to behave well. And as the Maharal says, when everyone knows their place, when you know your potential, when you know what you can live up to, then there's no machlokas, there's no argument, there's no friction. Arguments, whether it's communal, whether it's national, politics, whatever, are always caused by people stepping out of line. If you knew your role, if you know exactly where you were supposed to be and you knew where they were supposed to be, their qualities, there's no stepping out of line. There's no machlokes. Yerushalayim is the city of peace. So I'd like to close with a couple of anecdotes about peace, but about different people coming together that you may not have expected. The first was a yeshiva experience of mine. As Rabbi Nick hinted to before, I started out my yeshiva career in Yeshivat HaKotel. I was there for 2 years. Then I studied in a yeshiva called Mir for 3 years, and there are Tzvis for 4 years. At one point, I was made kind of like the co-gabbai, warden, if you like, in Yeshivat HaKotel. And my job was, at one point on a Friday, I would have to go down to the Kotel and scout a bimah or a shtender to save it for the boys coming down. Now, the boys coming down didn't mean 10 people. HaKotel had this custom to dance down to the Kotel on Friday night. So at one point, I went down an hour early, as was the custom, and I went to save this shtender. At that point, like 3 or 4 Israelis came up to me and said, hey, why are you saving the shtender? It's not fair. We want to daven it. So I said, well, I understand that, but in a few moments' time, in a few minutes, there are going to be a few people that come to join me. And they said, really? They didn't believe me at all. Maybe it was the broken Hebrew. They didn't believe me at all. They said, really? They said, how many? I said, a lot. Trust me. And I remember their faces, as they saw like 120 boys dancing down, or 200 boys dancing down from the yeshiva, all the way to their bimah, so to speak, their shtender. I still remember their faces. And of course, Jerusalem being Jerusalem, they joined in. There wasn't friction. It's a spiritual thing. In spirituality, Rav Dessler says, there's room for everyone. There's unlimited resources. They joined in, and people from right wing and left wing, soldiers, whatever, they all joined in. That's what Friday night is at the Kotel. The other anecdote before we close is many years later, actually last year, about 16 to 18 months ago, I had probably my best visit to Jerusalem since we'd left. I took a group of Stanmore people on a yeshiva trip. We sat and learned in the morning, and in the afternoon, we went to see various personalities, trips, museums. It was beautiful. At one point, I decided we were going to take them to the Mir Yeshiva. Now, just to get a bit of a picture, you should Google this afterwards. I haven't prepared slides. I'm not that sophisticated technologically. The Mir Yeshiva is a bit of a town. There's 6,000 students that learn there. When you go in, it is a sea of black and white. And everyone more or less wears the same, different personalities completely, but more or less wears the same. And I'm bringing in a group of Stanmore men to see the Mir Yeshiva. Of course, they stand out like a sore thumb, but I wanted them to get the experience. How often are we in a room of 1,000 people? Some of these places with all the everything together, 1,000 people in one room studying together. It's basically a series of building. It's unbelievable. Cacophony of noise, piercing sound, much like Rabbi Levine's loudest silence in the world that was Nate's at the Kotel. This is just the loudest noise in the world in terms of the spiritual, just pulsating. It's beautiful. Anyway, we went up to the top floor. It's the biggest base medrash. It's called Beis Yeshaya. At that point, I was a bit nervous and a bit reserved. So I stepped back and I wanted them to go have a look. What's happening? Someone from the yeshiva came towards them, one of the rabbis actually, and started chatting. And they had this beautiful, lovely conversation, about where you're from and how's it going. I'm telling you, culturally, these people could not have been more different than the people learning in the yeshiva. But, and this wasn't prompted, this wasn't arranged beforehand. I mean, we told them we were coming, but not to that exact area. They got on, they spoke, and when we did the summary afterwards, they said that one of their most powerful moments was A, seeing that in action, but B, being welcomed by people who are very different, but by people who treated them absolutely with dignity, respect, and were genuinely interested in them, and of course, their spiritual growth as well. Those are 2 elements of unity within Jerusalem: spiritual accomplishment, spiritual completion, and having room for everyone. And therefore, if I can just close with maybe 2 or 3 practical lessons, things we can get from this evening as we head towards our last session of the 3 weeks. And the first one is very simple. No one should go to Israel without going to Jerusalem. We have a beautiful family in our community. They go to Eilat in the February holidays, half term normally, but they go via Jerusalem. They fly into Tel Aviv, they take a cab or a car down to Jerusalem to the Kotel, 15 minutes, then down to Eilat. They don't go to Israel without going to Jerusalem. They don't go to Israel without going to the Kotel, to the old city. But when we are in Jerusalem, I think it's the point of taking it up a notch, connect to that purity. You know, if you daven a certain amount when you're in London, daven a bit more in Jerusalem. If you have certain standards of I don't know, learning or kashrut, whatever in London, take it up a notch when you're in Jerusalem. I think the other thing, and I found this very powerful myself, I admit, is during the 9 days, I have this very strange custom. And the truth is, my wife doesn't know I have this. So please don't tell it to her. I'm just going to share it very privately with 100 or so people on this call. Before I go to bed every single night of the 9 days, apart from Friday night, I sit on the floor for about 25 seconds and I imagine what it must have felt like to walk through the temple doors. Like a vivid picture, as much as I'm able to, of imagining the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, and what it must have meant. Literally walking through doors in very simple terms. I cannot tell you how powerful that has been for me in terms of connecting to the 9 days, connecting to Tisha B'Av, building that vivid resonance of what the Beis Hamikdash is. So it's going to Jerusalem, it's taking it up a notch, it's sitting on the floor, it's connecting to the purity of Jerusalem, and hopefully, as we say, that Hashem should give us back Yerushalayim, give us back Jerusalem in its real and proper, serene spiritual state, the city of peace, the city of Achdus, and those themes should resonate within us and reverberate amongst our communities, at least meanwhile. Just to remind everyone, before we thank all the rabbis and everyone for coming, next week, please God, and we have our interactive, our virtual tour, storyline tour of elements of the old city, talking about what was by Rabbi Shiloni. And we thank Rabbi Koetz, who's been in touch with Rabbi Shiloni. It'll be on this here channel, this here time, as they say on the radio, same time, same place next week. Thank you very much, everyone.